So I was going to do an update on the Make Stuff 2021 challenge today, but frankly, it just seemed kind of boring. So I thought instead I would do a deep dive into the combat system for my Dungeon Crawl board game. Now, this is something that I've been kind of banging my head against for a while, trying to figure out, and I spent all of September just deeply focused on trying to solve the combat system because it's kind of the last piece of the puzzle for shipping this board game. And it's also been haunting me with Realms of Solace, the roll and write game. I get all these other systems like really far along, and then it comes to combat, and I really kind of struggle with it because the combat system draws on all the other systems. You know, the combat system draws on the character and the character stat blocks, and on the weapons and the weapon types and the weapon stats, and the monster and the monster types and all the monster stats, and then all the other conditions and afflictions. And then there needs to be like a randomization element to it that ties into it all. And all those different systems have to work symbiotically and communicate with each other for a combat system to be successful. And then there needs to be a damage system that, you know, it needs to output some sort of damage, or it's complicated. There's a lot of moving parts to a combat system for a game like this. And so I thought it would be really interesting to just do a little discussion, a little post-mortem on the types of challenges I faced with my combat system, the types of problems that I was trying to solve, and then the iterative thinking that I went through to solve those problems, and then the final product that I arrived at. And it kind of surprised me. This combat system is more unlike other combat systems than I thought it would be. My original goal was just to rip off like the combat system from Descent or Shadows of Brimstone or, you know, Citadel of Blood or one of those games. The problems that I needed to solve were quite different than the problems that Descent solved and the problems that Shadows of Brimstone solved. I mean, my game is a lot different. It's designed specifically for solitaire, and I have a lot of very specific goals that I wanted to hit with my combat system. So I didn't know what the result was going to look like. I just knew the boxes that result had to check. And when I arrived at the final result, I'm like, wow, I wasn't expecting that. It was kind of a surprise. If the solution I come up with for any kind of creative problem surprises me, then I'm happy. So I'm pretty happy with the combat system. We'll see if it stands the test of time. We'll see if it holds up to scrutiny. We'll see if it holds up to all the playtesting that I'm going to throw at it. But so before I get into the nuts and bolts, I thought I would just show my sketchbook real quick. This is what problem solving looks like to me. Like when I'm problem solving, I'm drawing charts, I'm drawing diagrams, I am scribbling notes, I am keeping track of which stats are important, which pieces of information are not important to the combat system. I try to come up with some sort of result matrix and come out with like worst and best case scenarios. And then I realize that I don't have all the information I need on this chart. So I back out and I try to create a chart from a different direction that has a different set of data. And you know, this was a system where I was like, okay, monster size, weapon size, that gives me like the hit precision needed, and then I'm gonna add that to the blibbity blah. And like, so I went through like all these iterations on the combat system, trying to figure out how to connect all the dots. You know, there's the character information, there's the monster information, there's the weapon information, there's the modifiers and other like environmental, and all that has to like work together, not to mention the randomization to spit out some sort of result. And so I'm trying to figure out how to represent that with a simple chart or a couple charts. And so that's what all this is. It's just me basically trying to reverse engineer the math from some sort of like, from case studies of final outcomes. And that's kind of always how I've solved logic problems. I try to figure out, okay, well, like what is an outcome at this end of the spectrum? Draw a picture of it. What is an outcome at this end of the spectrum? Draw a picture of it. And then try to like figure out how to connect this picture to this picture, and start drawing pictures of the in-between states. And then eventually you start to see a graph emerge from these different snapshots of these different outcomes. You can see like, oh, this is the graph, this is the chart. And so that's what all of this work was. It was me taking snapshots of potential outcomes of a combat and then figuring out how to graph all the relevant information between those snapshots. And I think I finally arrived at a solution that sort of works. So here are the rules for designing my combat system. The first and most important rule is that this combat system needs to be designed for a solitaire game. It's designed from the ground up to be played solitaire. And every other decision I make about the game and about the combat system should support the idea that this is a solitaire game. So this was probably the biggest breakthrough I made in the way I was thinking about the mechanics for this game. And so because of that, the next big rule that I made was that die rolls should be for heroes, not monsters. So I want to build a system where you're only rolling for the heroes that you're playing. You're not rolling for the monsters. The monster logic should just be responding to the rolls you're making for your own heroes. So this sort of eliminates the notion of I go, you go. A lot of combat systems for a lot of dungeon crawls that I play, it's like I go, you go. Characters do their attacks, the monsters defend themselves, and then vice versa. The monsters do their attack, the characters defend themselves. And then you just go, I go, you go, I go, you go until somebody's dead. So that's not really going to work with this game. Instead, it's going to be more of like simultaneous. I'm probably spelling this wrong. I'm so used to spell correction now. Simultaneous attacks. So since we're not doing I go, you go, we can actually build a system where the attacks are happening simultaneously. So there needs to be one roll for the heroes that describes both the hero attacking and the monster defending, and the monster attacking and the hero defending. And that all needs to happen with a hero attack roll. So that, once I figured that out, I was like, wow, that's interesting. Okay. Now, one thing that's going to do is it's going to minimize the number of rolls required. So fewer rolls. That's always a good thing, in my opinion. Especially with a solitaire game where you have to sort of be the dungeon AI, the monster AI, and the characters. And I was trying to figure out how not to have to do dozens and dozens of dice rolls every turn just to make all these decisions that need to be made about the world and about the monster states and about the character states. So by doing only rolling for hero actions, not monster actions, and doing simultaneous attacks, we minimize the number of die rolls required. So that's huge. And that also has the side effect of minimizing, or at least reducing, crunch, in theory. If combined with a couple other constraints, we could reduce crunch, which is good. Another thing this does is it brings the whole game into a first-person perspective, or hero perspective, or point of view, POV. And by that I mean instead of looking at the monster card and seeing these stat blocks and being like, okay, the monster has, a strength of this and the hero has a strength of that. Instead of sort of having this objective God view of your characters and the monsters, the view is really from the point of view of your character. So when you're looking at a monster card, you're not seeing stats for that monster. It doesn't really matter. There's no way a character is going to know like what the strength stat of a boar bear is. I mean, they know the boar bear is strong and powerful, but they're not going to have access to like the stats of a boar bear. So that comes back to this notion that like the whole game is hero focused, and then all the other things should sort of be built around the hero's point of view. And so that's going to have a huge impact on the combat system. That's going to lead to like minimizing monster stats, or even just eliminating stats. After my playthroughs with Jeff, I was convinced that monsters needed stats, but I was still sort of using the old I go, you go mentality about combat. And now that I've worked through that and I'm past that, I really don't think monsters need stats anymore. They just need a system for reacting to things the player is doing, and that's it. So those are the main rules for the combat system. And I needed to come up with a system that kind of abides by these rules. And then the next thing I wanted to do was figure out what systems play into the combat system. Like, what do we need to know to even do a combat role? We need to know the hero stats, and that's basically might, agility, and stealth. Now the mental stats are probably going to play more into the magic system, but for now, let's just keep it simple and say that, we need access to the hero stats to have combat. We need access to the weapon stats. And during the course of my endless sketchbook brainstorming, I realized that the weapons need, at the very least, the weapons need a weight and they need a length. So I tried to think of all the different types of weapons. Some weapons are really long and heavy, like a two-handed broadsword. Some weapons are light and short, like a dagger. But then some weapons are like long and light. So I think the weight, length really needs to be kind of a two-dimensional graph. And I think where I landed on weight was light, medium, and heavy. And where I landed on length was like short, medium, and long. So you need to know these things. And then there's another factor with weapons, and that could be like sharpness, or sharp versus blunt. So that would be the difference between a sword and like a war hammer, and those are going to produce different types of damage. And then, so that's weapon. And then the next thing we need to factor into combat would be, we'll say modifiers. And that's going to be afflictions. Like, say a character's poisoned, they're not going to fight as well, so maybe they'll have like a -1 or whatever. And environmental. Hazards or conditions. will affect combat. So those are modifiers that you'll add to, or subtract from your hero stat. And then there's two more things. There's the monster stats, and then there's the randomization. So that's basically your die roll. And then the monster stats, what kind of monster stats do you need to know for the monster to be able to react to the hero rolls you're doing? And I think I came up with monster size plays a huge role. So that's going to be like small, medium, large, and giant. But then I was thinking some monsters are fast and some are slow. So there's probably going to be like a speed. And then I got to thinking like each monster sort of, it'd be cool if each monster could have its own behavior or its own reaction to certain weapon types. So I'm still trying to figure out exactly what kind of monster stats are needed to pull this off. But I do know for a fact that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different systems that all need to communicate with each other for combat to work. And it all needs to happen with rolls that you're only making for the hero, not the monsters. I also realized at some point that the weapons should relate to the heroes in that some weapons are heavy and sort of might focused, and some are lighter and more agility focused. So I like the idea that every weapon has a tag that matches one of the hero stats. So some weapons are might weapons, some weapons are agility weapons, and some weapons might be might and agility. So the broadsword would be a might weapon. And so whenever you use that weapon in combat, you reference the might stat of the character using that weapon. Whereas like a fighting staff would be like an agility weapon. It's a light sort of martial art weapon. And so whenever you attack with that weapon, you use the character's agility stat. So that's how weapons are connected to the hero stats. And some heroes will even have like a built-in special bonus. So like if the fighter is using the double-handed broadsword, he'll get an extra +1 because not only does he use might weapons, but he's also skilled. He's an expert at the broadsword. So that's how hero stats, weapon stats, and hero special abilities all relate and communicate with each other. And then the environmental and affliction modifiers will just be subtracted from this total, or from the die roll. But then it's like, okay, if I'm only going to do one roll, what would the results of that roll look like? And basically, the result is going to be hero stat for the weapon they're using, plus modifiers, plus a randomized die roll. And so that's how we sort of get the attack strength, but then how does that relate to the monster stats? So what would the results of the attack strength look like? So we'll say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Character stats all fall between 1 and 6. This is the entire range of their stats. It's a pretty low range. And then this is the entire range of the randomization. So it's a pretty low range. So let's say they have a might stat of 6, and then you roll a 6. So that's up to 12. And then let's say the modifiers, you could get up to a plus or minus 3 modifier. So now you're up to 15. And I think where I came out was that you're basically going to end up with a combat result ranging somewhere between, it wouldn't even be 1, it'd be like, the worst, if you had like a might of 1 and you rolled a 1, you'd end up with a 2. So your result's going to be somewhere between 2 and 15. So 15 would be an extraordinary result for an attack. That's like you got a might of 6, you roll a 6 with your broadhand sword, you've got a +3 modifier. That's like as good as it gets. That's going to be a 15. So that's your range. And then it just comes down to, what would a hit on a monster be? Well, if we're always rolling high, did I add that here? That's another rule. That's another rule. Another rule is roll high always for success. It bugs me when systems have like some rolls you roll low to succeed, some rolls you roll high. I think for this game I just want like higher is always better no matter what. Lower is always worse. So then you just have to figure out for every monster, like what do you need to roll? So let's say for bats, a bat is a fairly small, fairly weak monster. And let's say for a bat, you need to roll like a 5 or better. So if this is your bat graph, basically this would be a hit. Now you could say, okay, if you roll a 5 or better, that's a hit. And let's say you roll like a 10 or better, that's a crit. So the bat would have this chart maybe on the monster card itself, and it's like, oh, okay, very simple. I roll during a fight, I roll 5 or more, I hit the bat, 10 or more, it's a crit hit, kill the bat. And then you could do like symbols here, like, okay, this would indicate that like a bat has 2 hit points, and then a crit would be like both of them or whatever. And then that would mean, so if we're doing one roll and we're only rolling for heroes, that we have to figure out if the monster hits you. So anything less than 5. So you roll your 1 die, you roll more than 5, you hit the bat, you roll more than 10, you kill the bat. But if you roll less than 5, the bat hits you. And so here with 1 die roll, we've determined whether we've successfully hit the monster or whether the monster has successfully hit us. And this doesn't always have to be exactly like that. I mean, you could have a monster where it's incredibly hard for you to hit the monster, so you have to get a 12 or higher to hit. We'll call this monster X. But let's say the monster also is just not that good at combat. He's really hard to hit, maybe because he's super fast, or maybe because he has a ton of armor, but let's say he also is not really equipped. So he may only hit you on a 3 or less. And so this would just be a miss. And then you could have some monsters, where like this would be a hit on the monster. But let's say the monster, let's hit monster, and this is hit you. So in this particular case, I'll call this monster Y, there is overlap where you both hit. And in this particular case, you could employ a defensive strategy like evade, deflect, absorb, and that would determine who gets the hit, or if you get the hit on him, but you're able to evade the hit on you. So this middle ground right here with overlapping hit, not overlapping miss, but overlapping hit. This is where this is your wiggle room for defensive strategy here. And the monster could have a defensive strategy baked into it that determines what it's going to do when it's in this zone. So this was starting to come very close to what I was trying to achieve. And so far it checks all the boxes for the rules that I was trying to adhere to. You're only rolling for the character, not the monster. You roll high for success. You roll low for failure. And in terms of combat, failure means the monster hits you. There's room for a miss, and then there's room for overlapping hits where you could potentially employ a defensive strategy or armor, that type of thing. This was close, but still kind of missing a little bit of what I needed it to include, which is I love the idea that each monster has its own chart, but the charts weren't covering everything. So I put a little more thought into the monsters, and I realized that the chart for the monster needs to be 2-dimensional, not 1-dimensional, and this will give me some extra crunch without really adding crunch to what the player needs to keep track of. The one thing these charts weren't really including were the complexity of the weapon stats. So we'll call this short, medium, long. So this is weapon weight, I guess. And this is length. So every single monster will have this little chart on the back side of the monster card. And then when you attack, say you're going to attack the bat, you have to look at the weapon you're attacking with. So for a bat, you want long, light weapons. So here it would be like let's say a fighting staff. You have a pretty decent chance of hitting the bat. So you would need a 6+ on your attack roll to hit the bat. Very similar to what we had here on the bat chart, but now you're factoring in the weapon weight and the weapon length. Now, if you have a medium weapon, it's heavier, it moves a little slower, so you would need a 7+ to hit the bat. And then if you have a light weapon, but it's not as long, it's not going to be quite as effective, so you need a 7. And then if you have a medium weight weapon that's not as long, it's going to be even less effective, so you need an 8+. So this right here is telling you basically the same information that this chart was telling you, although it's factoring in the specifics of the weapon that you're using. Now, if you're using a light weapon that's short, like a knife, you can't attack the bat. It's almost impossible to attack a bat with a knife. You just don't have the reach. So all short weapons are kind of a no-go. And then all super heavy weapons are kind of a no-go. You can't really attack a bat with a double-handed broadsword. It's just too heavy and too slow. So for bats, you can only attack a bat if your weapon is medium or light, and if it's medium or long in terms of length. And then for each one of these cells on this chart, you have your 2 hit. And then you can also have the bats 2 hit in these same spots. But then I realized that the bats 2 hit could actually just be on a chart below. So 4- might be a hit for the bat. and then you could do damage, 1d6. The dragon is pretty much at the opposite end of the spectrum. And with a dragon, you're basically going to want a heavy weapon that's long, like a double-handed broadsword, to fight a dragon. And, you might need, and it's also going to be hard to hit, so you're going to need like a 10 plus. And then obviously a medium weapon is, that might be an 8 plus. Or sorry, that would be a little harder, so that's going to be like a 12 plus. And this might be a 12 plus. And then a medium weapon of medium length might be like 14 plus or whatever. And then it may just be impossible I think it's impossible to hit a dragon with a knife. This is a two-handed broadsword down at this end. This would be a knife at this end. And I think light weapons are just not going to do any damage, and short weapons are going to be problematic too. So with a dragon, you kind of have like a completely different paradigm with a dragon than you would with bats. And so that's what I'm getting at now. This is where I've kind of landed with this whole thing. So in my sketchbook, this was me figuring out like the difference between, I tried to take like monsters at the opposite end of the spectrum. The only thing bats and dragons have in common is that they both fly. But at one end of the spectrum, you want a light, fast, long weapon to kill a bat. But with a dragon, you really want to go with like the long, heaviest weapon you have. And then the only thing I haven't factored into this yet is the sharpness. So I think some creatures are going to be easier to hit with a sharp weapon, and some are going to require blunt force. And I think once I get this type of thing built into these charts, I'm pretty much going to be like where I want to be with all this. And this is not fight to the death. Like, I think each combat round is just a hit. So it's not like you go into combat mode and you stay there until one party is dead. You basically, like, for your turn, you can be like, okay, well, I'm going to move, and now I'm adjacent, so I'm going to hit. And then the next turn, you're not locked in combat. Like, you can move, you can try to get away. They might chase you. You can try to hit again. The other thing that I want to include is the number in group. So if you're surrounded by bats, which you will be, because bats are a group creature, I think what I'm going to do is, I think it's going to subtract from your attack roll. So it's going to be easier for the bats to get a hit on you. So basically simultaneous attack even with a group. So you're not necessarily calculating the result of every single bat. You're thinking of the bat as a group if you're surrounded on all four sides by bats. And that's going to decrease your attack roll. So it's going to slide the attack to the left. It's going to make the attack lower, and it's going to make it more likely that the bats are going to do damage to you. So now that I have this almost worked out, I'm going to finish figuring out sharpness versus blunt weapons and how those affect these charts, and also the number of monsters in the monster group and how that's going to affect these charts. And once I have that dialed in and play tested a little bit, then I'm going to go through and iterate on these cards. And the monster chart, this chart is basically going to be like on the back of each card. I've also been iterating on the formatting and the iconography used for these stats and making that a lot more clear. So this next push is going to be huge. And when I finish it, hopefully in the next week or so, I'll have a fully functioning combat system that works well with monster cards that are very accessible, easy to understand. And then lastly, I've spent dozens of hours actually just in Google Docs, making a spreadsheet of all the assets in the game and giving them unique IDs and describing the behaviors for each, and figuring out exactly like how they all interact with each other, and figuring out what the rule set for every single attribute's going to be. I've come up with like warning chits, sort of like in Magic Realm, but basically the backside of every monster counter is going to be some sort of warning. So for instance, like the backside of the mold man is just going to be like dankness, and the backside of the cultist is going to be chanting. So when you first spawn a monster, if they're not within line of sight, you actually just spawn the warning side of the chit, and that's an indicator that, like, you know, your party hears something in the distance. They hear chanting, but the cultists are not activated yet, that kind of thing. I'm still kind of working on the hint/warning system, but it's just basically just iterating on the spawning of the monsters and making it a little more interesting. And then I've been working on the power items. The monsters now are broken down into logical groups. Like there's wandering monsters, boss monsters, and environmental hazards for every location type. So it's just more systematic now. And then there's also demons, which can be discovered in any location. And then there are NPCs. And so everything is just a lot more categorized now into these special classes, and it's just kind of making everything a little more easy to grok for me and for the player. Lost artifacts, treasure and loot, weapons, tools, arcana. So I'm still working on this, but when I finish with this, I'm going to have a master document that has all the assets on it and describes like everything you need to know about the asset, every single piece of information that needs to be on the asset itself or in the rule book. And so this is just taking like an enormous amount of time too. So I'm moving along, I'm making a ton of progress on this game, but you know, it's both exhilarating and a little terrifying. After I finished those playthroughs with Jeff, I felt like I'd really accomplished something and hit this grand milestone, but also I was left with a sense of dread because I knew just how much I had left to do. Just an epic amount of work left to finish this silly little game that no one's probably ever going to play. But you know, that's the price of being in the state of being an artist, is you know, just I have to do it. I have to get it done. Even if it's never touched by another human being, like I have to finish this project now.